Good evening. My name is Tegan Kehoe, and I'm the Research and Adult Program Director at the Paul Revere House. I'd like to welcome you all to the first lecture of our 2024 series. As many of you know, this series is generously funded by the Lowell Institute, and it typically takes place in September and October. Here, we're trying something new by kicking off the series with one lecture in the summer and then continuing it in the fall. Our summer lecture is a part of the nationwide celebration of civic season, the period from Juneteenth to the 4th of July. Our hope is that this year's lectures will provide a glimpse into what it was like in the colonies in 1774. 250 years ago, Paul Revere and his contemporaries probably understood that they were living through an important and challenging period in history. They were involved in grand movements while also dealing with the ups and downs of daily life, many of which were also entwined with political events. I'm reminded of the phrase, "May you live in interesting times." To tell us more about the daily realities of life in Boston in 1774, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Joseph Adelman. Dr. Adelman is an associate professor of history at Framingham State University and an associate editor of the New England Quarterly. He is the author of Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing the News, 1763 to 1789. This evening, he'll discuss how Bostonians lost access to goods and work that they relied on after British officials closed the port of Boston on June 1st, 1774, and explore how working people coped with the economic fallout. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. If you're watching the program live, please feel free to add questions and comments in the YouTube chat. A staff member is monitoring them, and we'll have a Q&A portion at the end. Thank you very much to Frederic and the GBH Forum Network team for your live streaming support tonight and the whole series. And thank you to Dr. Adelman for joining us. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
And to everyone at the Paul Revere House for inviting me to join you. I am very excited to be giving a lecture in this series and be part of it. And thank you as well on my part to Frederic and everyone at the GBH Forum Network for their work in making the live streaming possible and getting everything set up. And thanks to all of you who are joining us this evening live, or if I can break the fourth wall, for anyone who's watching this at some point later on YouTube. I hope you find it interesting and educational, and I look forward to chatting with you later during the Q&A. So I'm going to, as is custom, pull up my slides and we will go ahead and get started. So as Tegan noted, and as you may have seen if you saw the advertisement, what I've called the talk is When Boston Was Closed, Ordinary Bostonians and the Intolerable Acts. But I'd be remiss if I did not start by noting that in terms of the date that we're giving this talk, that we're gathering this evening, is the 2nd of July, which John Adams, another local Bostonian son, thought would be a little more important than it actually turned out to be. So on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia formally voted to approve independence, and they were still working on the Declaration. So the next day, on the 3rd, John Adams famously wrote to his wife, Abigail, and wrote, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I'm apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore." Of course, as we know, he was off by 2 days on when the celebrations would take place, though he seemed to have a good idea of what they would look like. And if any of you are fans of 1776, the musical, you might recognize that this letter provided most of a verse of one of the songs in that musical. So he was helpful in that regard. As Tegan noted at the outset, we're in the midst of a commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And Paul Revere House and Boston have been involved in that for really a decade, going back to the 250th anniversary of the Stamp Act riots in 2015, the Boston Massacre in 2020, last fall and winter with the Boston Tea Party. And so now that we're moving ahead in time as we track, we're up to the point where we're thinking about the events that really get us close to the revolution and everything that it wrought. So in 1774, which is where we're going to be focused today, Massachusetts faced its most significant crisis of governance in almost 100 years. In response to the dumping of tea in Boston Harbor back in December of 1773, Parliament closed the port of Boston, replaced the governor of the colony, and wrested judicial power from local authorities. Now, the historian Mary Beth Norton describes this time period as the long 1774, which she does to link the tea crisis in the fall of 1773 with events leading up to Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. But let's start with some background about Boston in the 1770s. First, it was a very small place geographically and in terms of population. So what I've got on the screen, many of you watching may know that much of the land that makes up Boston today is landfill. The dark green portion is what would have existed in the 18th century. So the Shawmut Peninsula was Boston. The Back Bay was a bay, not a neighborhood. The airport was mostly underwater and had not been filled in. So we're talking about a really, really small geographic space. In addition, unlike other port towns, Boston's population had stagnated in the middle of the 18th century. It stopped growing. It started to recover in the 1760s. And so around this time, it had just a shade over 15,000 people living there. So I'll switch to a contemporary map from the 1720s. So even though that population number may seem small, 15,000 is not a lot of people. Boston was quite a crowded place. And the options for getting materials into town, food and fuel in particular, were very limited. And obviously that's something that I'm trying to foreshadow. But you can see the only options are to bring it in by ship to one of the many wharves in the bottom right of the map that's on the screen, or to bring in by land across Boston Neck, which was one street wide at its narrowest, and so was not a particularly effective method for bringing goods in and out of town. So what led up to Boston closing the port? It goes back to tea, and specifically the Tea Act. Parliament passed this law in early 1773 to solve a problem that, ironically enough, had very little to do with the colonies. The East India Company was in dire financial straits. It was failing. It was near bankruptcy. And to compound the matter, many members of Parliament were themselves investors in the company. So they were doubly interested in seeing that it succeed. So in return, they passed the Tea Act of 1773, which does a couple of things, some of which you may know, some of which you may not. So the most famous part of it is that it granted the company a monopoly on tea sales in North American colonies. It did so by distributing the tea through the appointment of commissioners in the colonial towns where it was going to be delivered. It lowered the tax on tea, which the British saw as a concession, but it increased customs enforcement to try to prevent smuggling, which had been a huge problem and had made money for a lot of people, not least one of Paul Revere's compatriots, John Hancock. So in addition to helping the East India Company, they picked tea because they thought it would actually raise a fair amount of revenue. Americans drank a lot of tea. According to one historian, American colonists consumed between half a pound and 3/4 of a pound of tea leaves per capita each year. And if you think about how light a tea bag is, of how much tea that would be today, that's quite a lot. That meant that not only were anti-imperial protesters motivated by wanting to challenge British authority, but they were actually worried that people would accept the tax because they so were addicted to tea. What would happen if the beverage turned out to be so popular that people were willing to accept the little bit of inconvenience of having to buy this British East India Company tea and allow Britain to gain a principal point that the Patriots did not want them to gain. So, in the fall of 1773, the Sons of Liberty and other groups ignored the tax cut and focused their attention on the monopoly and the customs enforcement and the distribution by commissioner. They coordinated Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston with other port towns to refuse the tea, lest anyone brew it. And then in Boston, when the ships showed up at the end of November, a 20-day stalemate ensued where the Sons would not let merchants unload the tea, and the governor and customs officials wouldn't let the ships leave. So at the end of that 20 days, a group of men disguised as natives boarded the ships and dumped 340 chests of tea into the harbor on December 16, 1773. They then immediately spread news of what they had done to try and cultivate support, sending Paul Revere on horseback down to New York and to Philadelphia with the news. He reached Philadelphia in just 8 days, which is a remarkable speed to travel in the 18th century between Boston and Philadelphia. Sometimes these days it feels like that on I-95, but it actually was pretty fast for the 18th century. And so he arrived, handed the news to printers in Philadelphia who published this, a Christmas box for the customers of the Pennsylvania Journal with the news. And you can see, I realize not very well on the screen, but there's headings for Boston and for New York. And there's all sorts of accounts of the Boston Tea Party, including what I think actually is Revere's own words under the heading Thursday. So to the Sons of Liberty, this was an act of righteous protest. They were safeguarding a principle. It should be noted that it was not really all that popular to a lot of colonists, and for obvious reasons to many Britons. It was an egregious act of vandalism and property destruction. So they knew consequences were coming. They kept up the pressure. In January, the town meeting voted to ban the sale of tea altogether, lest any of the company tea end up in a Bostonian's pot. There was a confrontation between George Robert Twelves Hughes, a local shoemaker who had been a participant in the Tea Party, and John Malcolm, who was a local customs officer. Malcolm, in this altercation, injured Hughes severely with his cane. And in response, the Sons of Liberty gathered up Malcolm, dragged him through town, and tarred and feathered him in retaliation, which was, by the by, his second tarring and feathering. So these political disputes are turning more and more violent. Meanwhile, people wait. They knew at the time that it would take 4 to 6 weeks for the news to reach London. They knew that there would be some time for consideration. They knew it would take another 4, 5, probably 6 weeks or so for a response to arrive back in North America. And indeed, once reports arrived in Parliament around the end of January, beginning of February of 74, infuriated members immediately began to debate exactly how to punish Boston for the destruction of thousands of pounds sterling worth of tea. The company itself demanded financial restitution for its losses in Boston, and in other places, the tea in Charleston, South Carolina, for example, had been sequestered and hidden, and they asked that the Treasury auction the tea off in Charleston to get them money. Right? The East India Company has spent all of this money transporting it, and they have not been paid. What the House of Commons and Parliament come up with after a few weeks of deliberation is this set of laws that are known as the Intolerable Acts. That is, of course, not of course, but that is Malcolm being tarred and feathered as a new method of macaroni making in Boston. And now we have the Intolerable Acts. The news of these arrived in May of 1774. There's 4 of them, and then I've placed off to the side the Quebec Act. So the first of these was directly about the Tea Party, was the Boston Port Act. It required Boston to pay restitution to the East India Company in the amount of 9,659 pounds sterling, which would cover the cost of the 340 chests of tea and the amount of the duty that would have been collected under the Tea Act. If Boston didn't do that, and until it did, the act ordered the port of Boston closed as of June 1st, 1774. No trade in, no trade out at all. Second, Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which removed the charter that had governed the colony since 1691. It placed the entire colony under a military rather than a civilian governor. It prohibited town meetings, and anyone watching this who's from Massachusetts knows at how deeply that must have cut the residents of Massachusetts at that time. Town meetings were a critical part of Massachusetts colonists' self-identity. And it turned colony officials, a number of colony officials, into appointments made by the crown rather than by local authorities. Third was the Impartial Administration of Justice Act. This made it possible for trials related to maritime issues, things that happened at sea, to be moved from Boston to London. So the idea was that a British official couldn't be tried in Boston for something that Massachusetts thought he had done wrong. He would have to go back to London. So it was a way to protect imperial officials. And then the last of these is the Quartering Act, which cemented the ability of the British Army to lodge soldiers in private homes when they were stationed in the colonies. Now, the Quebec Act. This is another law that Parliament passed in roughly this same time frame that wasn't actually part of the response to the Boston Tea Party. The Quebec Act formed a government for what had been French Canada that Britain had claimed at the end of the 7 Years' War. It allowed religious toleration for Catholics. The remaining French population were Catholics. It allowed Canada to keep some elements of French law, and Bostonians and Massachusettsans and New Englanders were deeply afraid of that. A key part of their identity as well was that they hated and feared the French and Catholics. And so the British government offering peaceful relations to French Catholics was something that they deemed, one might say, intolerable. Okay, so to sum up, they waited 5 months for Britain's reaction, and then had just a few weeks of notice that the port was being shut down and that their new governor would be General Thomas Gage, who had previously been the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. The reaction in Boston was, in a word, apoplectic. There was a group of loyalist merchants who convened and offered to pay the fine themselves, but the Sons of Liberty actually blocked that move lest they appear acquiescent to British authority and tyranny. Instead, they declared the acts amounted to oppression. So in early June, here, the Boston Gazette and Country Journal resorted to biblical imagery, invoking the Old Testament second book of Samuel to declare that the town was more insulted by an English armament than it ever had been by French or Spanish forces. Isaiah Thomas, who was printer of the Massachusetts Spy, worked with our friend Paul Revere to engrave a new header for his newspaper. They added the snake at the bottom, adapted from Benjamin Franklin's iconic Join or Die image to depict the American colonies as a snake challenging the oppressive British dragon. The news of the acts also brought waves of sympathy from across the colonies and covered up some of the frustration that people had felt about Boston dumping the tea. So none other than George Washington, for example, wrote in response to a fellow Virginian that the cause of Boston is and ever will be considered as the cause of America, parentheses, not that we approve their conduct in destroying the tea. He was not happy about that. So across the colonies, what happened next is a relatively familiar story. There were calls for Congress to convene, which it did in September in Philadelphia. They met for several weeks with a wide range of opinions for how to respond, but ended up agreeing to a large-scale boycott of British goods. That's a story for another time, though, because I want us to come back to Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, the Boston Port Act and the Government Act, these various acts had a number of implications. First of all, very immediately, a lot of people lost jobs. One of the key industries in Boston, in fact, the key industry that related to everything and in the Boston economy was trade and commerce and shipping. So again, you can see on this colonial map, wharves and docks sticking out from the land on the bottom side of the map, which is basically the east side of Boston, headlined by Long Wharf, which is, as you might imagine, the longest one. There were so many sailors. There were so many ship workers, people who worked on the docks, carters, people who worked unloading and loading goods, people who worked as rope makers, people who worked on the ships themselves, physically on the ships themselves, on building and repairing the ships. All of those people, all working people, immediately lost work to a very significant degree. As we'll see later, some of them stayed and tried something else. Many of them, however, left town to try to find work elsewhere. Second, thousands of British troops showed up again and occupied the town for the first time since the aftermath of the Boston Massacre 4 years earlier. 4 regiments of soldiers, plus some family members and support staff, increased the population of the town significantly. There are thousands of soldiers in a town of about 15,000 people. And there wasn't much space to put them. The common, as you can see, was not a particularly big space. So with the added muscle of the new Quartering Act, General Gage and his regimental commanders had fewer concerns about how to house the troops than they did in the late 1760s during the first occupation. Bostonians also had a relatively complicated relationship with British soldiers. In the 1760s, many of the soldiers had lived in local homes. Some of them had dated or married local women. Some of them had had children and had them baptized in local churches, serving as godchildren for local parents and having locals serve as godparents for them. And if you're interested in more about this, I strongly recommend Serena Zabin's book on the Boston Massacre, if you'd like to learn more about that occupation and those relationships. The situation is different in 1774, but we still need to remember that the image of soldiers on one side and civilians on the other is not quite as clear-cut as we make it out to be. That said, one of the circumstances that we get is conflicts between soldiers and townspeople. One of the chroniclers of this was a woman named Jane Meekum, whose maiden name was Franklin. She was the younger sister of Benjamin Franklin. She still lived in Boston. She was his favorite sister, and so they corresponded regularly. And she wrote to her brother in 1774 about some of the things that were going on. So at present, we have a melancholy prospect for this winter, at least. The towns being so full of profligate soldiers and many such officers, there is hardly 24 hours passes without some fray amongst them, and one can walk but a little way in the street without hearing their profane language. So they're constantly around, they're profane. We were much surprised the other day, she continues, upon hearing a tumult in the street and looking out, saw a soldier all bloody damning his eyes, but he would kill every inhabitant he met, and pressing into a shop opposite us with his bayonet drawn, bursting through the glass door, and the man of the house pushing him out, and he to do what mischief he could, dashing the chimney and earthenware, which stood on the window through the sashes with the most terrible imprecations. And this is just one example of many. Jane, I should note, was not a wealthy woman at all. She relied on her brother, frankly, for support. Her husband probably had a severe what we would have described as a mental illness, but was not able to work. Her oldest son, Benjamin, named after his uncle, also had difficulty with working, probably because of mental illness. So she, like many, was relying on help from others. The third effect and Jane is one of them, is that many people left town if they could, which ironically does start to relieve the literal pressure of population on the town. There are many loyalists from the surrounding areas who begin to flock into Boston to seek protection from the British Army. Those are mostly wealthy people. But overall, there's an outflow of people beginning in the summer of 1774. For many, that meant moving parts of families, sending wife and children perhaps to a farm in an outlying area or to a relative in another town. That's a process that accelerated in the spring of 1775 as military tensions escalated, and especially after Lexington and Concord. George Hughes, our shoemaker who participated in the Tea Party, he sent his family away. He stayed in Boston to work. He sent his family to the town of Wrentham, which, if you're not familiar with Boston geography, is about 30 miles southwest of Boston in Massachusetts. Those who remained faced a series of crises that escalated as winter approached. So through the summer and fall, donations arrived from elsewhere in the colonies, carried by cart into Boston across the Boston Neck. They were shipped into other New England ports and then transported by land. There was an outpouring of support of food and fuel. But again, the Boston Neck is not the most useful, or not the largest highway to bring things. And with British warships patrolling the harbor waters, that left very limited supplies. We have accounts of this from a Boston shopkeeper named Harbottle Dorr, who all historians are grateful to because he kept 15 years worth of newspapers in the 1760s and 1770s, took notes on them, annotated them, and then wrote himself an index, which is held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, just a mile or two away from the Paul Revere House. If you go online, you can also look for the Harbottle Dorr newspapers, and the MHS has digitized them and made them all available for free. And for that, I am grateful because I have these wonderful images to be able to show you. So in his index for the volume covering 1774, I'll just highlight down here at the bottom, Dorr included several references to the great hardships on account of the Port Act, people sending a letter to the country on their great distresses, etc., related to living with that. And if we go to the newspaper from Dorr, which was a huge, important source of information for people, he links to a August 1st Boston Gazette story that starts, "More than 60 days have expired since Boston, by a late edict of the British Parliament, has been besieged by a British fleet and army and its trade annihilated. Suffice it at present to inform the world that though wood and provisions have been allowed us by said Port Act, the introduction of these articles has been attended with such a loss of time and unnecessary charges as greatly to raise the price of fuel upon the poor inhabitants." And indeed, that became the pressing concern. As the days grew shorter and cooler, the lack of firewood became even more pressing. It was a daily need for cooking, and situated on the small spit of land that it was, Boston had always imported wood for residents to use for fuel, for cooking year-round, and for heat in the colder months, which were many. Through the winters of 74, 75, and 1775, 76, the remaining residents, which got down as low as about 3,500 people plus soldiers, they ended up resorting to tearing apart pews of churches in Boston and other meeting houses to serve as fuel. It was just that hard, and it was the only source of heat. Essentially, we cannot underestimate how devastating this part of the act was on people. The difficulty with getting food in, the difficulty with getting fuel in, made life very difficult for people up and down the socioeconomic spectrum, but all the more so as we go further down towards the Jane Meachams and the George Hugheses, And frankly, the Paul Revere's, who was well-to-do for an artisan, but was still a working artisan and required business. He wasn't retired. He needed to keep working, and there weren't as many people looking for silver in 74 and 75. I want to show you one other way that we can see the loss of shipping, and that's my research is on newspapers, so you're going to get a lot of newspapers anytime I give a talk. In 1774, Boston had probably the most lively newspaper culture in North America. There were more people in Philadelphia, there were more people in New York, there were more newspapers in Boston, with 6 published each week. Most of those affiliated with the Patriots, but a few openly supported the imperial position, including the Massachusetts Gazette and Boston Newsletter, which until 74 was published by Richard Draper, and then after his death was continued by his wife, Margaret Draper. She ran the newspaper then throughout the British occupation. She supported her business with government contracts and with trying to sell the newspaper. And the reason why this is a good way to show the shifts in the economy is that the newspaper is a marker of advertising. That's the basic way that you fund a newspaper. People don't pay for subscriptions, but advertisers will pay. So in each 4-page issue of a newspaper, often a third or more of the space would be taken up with advertisements, including usually all of the back page, page 4. So as an example, here's an image from page 4 of the March 24th, 1774 issue of the Boston Newsletter, which you can take a look and see it is full of advertisements. Duck, wine, powder, flour, garden seeds by a John Adams who is not the John Adams who was in Philadelphia trying to gain independence. All sorts of goods, selling houses, trying to get people to put goods on ships, all sorts of things. I fast forward 1 year, exactly 52 weeks to the next late March issue, March 23rd, 1775. This is the back page of the issue. The Port Act has been in effect for 9 months, and there's no more advertising. There's a few very small things about selling personal goods in the bottom right corner of that page, but the advertisements are gone. Business is gone. There's no goods for sale. There's no flour at the shops. There's no ship stocked at the port. There's no shopkeepers. Draper as a loyalist is an interesting example and a useful example because she helps us take the story actually past 1776. She continued the newspaper up until February of 1776, at which point she packed up her belongings and one of her daughters and left with the British Army for London. Once she was in London, she spent the next decade petitioning for compensation from the British government. She wrote out a long petition for requests. She got letters of support from famous loyalists, members of the Oliver family, Thomas Hutchinson, Thomas Gage, General Gage signed a letter for her, essentially recommendation letters. And she claimed in her request for money that, quote, by her employment aforesaid, she rendered herself more the object of rancor and malice of the rebels than most others, and therefore was under the necessity of quitting the town. So we see that there's a disparate effect. A printer is not a usually wealthy person. They are working very hard. Margaret Draper had to work in her husband's absence, and she was destitute when she got to London and needed to spend that time to try and get funding. There's one other significant group that I want to make sure we talk a little bit about, and that's Black Bostonians, who are also facing deprivation, but also some see this as a moment of opportunity. So you are probably more familiar with Phyllis Wheatley, who was an enslaved woman owned by the Wheatley family, who had been brought over from West Africa at the age of 7 on a ship named the Phyllis, which is how she was given her given name. At this moment, by coincidence, she was just publishing her first book of poetry, and was just being manumitted, was just being emancipated from slavery by the Wheatley family. In fact, that first book that she had published was printed in London and was shipped over to North America, to Boston, on a ship called the Dartmouth. I didn't identify the tea ships earlier, but the Dartmouth was one of the tea ships. So it was sitting in the hold of the Dartmouth for 3 weeks, waiting for somebody to make a decision about the tea. And so she is personally caught up in that. For her, this moment is one of opportunity. She's able to write that is a special thing. But she remains a servant. She is freed, but is only able to continue working as a servant. There was a small but critical enslaved population in Boston. And this is also a moment when those enslaved men and women are seeing a moment of opportunity. They are suffering deprivations economically as everybody else, but they're also looking at the political rhetoric around them and seeing a way out. So this is just one example of a number of petitions that were filed with the general court, the legislature, with the governor. Some were published in the newspapers, asking for freedom for Black Americans. This particular petition is a petition to General/Governor Thomas Gage. And it's critically important that many Black Americans saw the British officials as more likely to be sympathetic than their American enslavers. And it shows us that they've absorbed revolutionary rhetoric. They see the British as potential emancipators. So just to pull 2 little quotes, it begins, "Your petitioners apprehend we have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms without being deprived of them by our fellow men, as we are a freeborn people and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatever." They're not directly quoting Jefferson and Adams and Otis and Hancock, but they have clearly absorbed all of that language and are using it to their advantage. They write later, "How can we fulfill our part of duty to him, to God, whilst in this condition, and as we cannot serve our God as we ought whilst in this situation, neither can we reap an equal benefit from the laws of the land, which doth not justify, but condemns slavery. Or if there had been any law to hold us in bondage, we are humbly of the opinion there never was any to enslave our children for life when born in a free country." Now, these petitions are not particularly successful. Massachusetts later is one of the earliest states to end slavery. And that's a story that comes just a little bit later. I've bounced around in time a little bit, so I want to pick up the story in April of 1775, because that moment causes a fundamental change in the quality of life for Boston residents. After the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, the British troops retreated back to Boston, and it very much truly became an armed, occupied garrison town. Anyone who could leave did. Many, many left in the days before. If you recall the story of the troops marching, one of their goals was to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were hiding in Lexington on the way. Over the ensuing weeks, then, thousands of New England militiamen poured into the towns surrounding Boston, ready to fight if the British were to venture out again, which they did at Bunker Hill in June. Once the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, it appointed the Virginian George Washington as commander-in-chief. He arrives in Cambridge on July 2nd, 1775, so another anniversary event as we get to the close of the talk. Now, in terms of who's in Boston, not only could materials only arrive via the British Navy on ship, the Continental Army was treating the town itself as hostile territory because it was occupied. And so they were limiting the flow of goods across land before it could reach British checkpoints on Boston Neck. To make matters worse, smallpox began spreading at this moment in eastern Massachusetts in the summer and fall of 1775. Most of the British soldiers had either had smallpox or been inoculated. Most of the American colonists had not been exposed and had not had it. And so it turned into a horrible epidemic of illness for colonists within the town of Boston and for the American troops gathered mostly in Cambridge, in and around the area of Harvard College. During that winter, Henry Knox, who had been a Boston bookseller, brought cannon back from Fort Ticonderoga in northern New York, and they were able to create batteries, set up batteries on Dorchester Heights overlooking the town of Boston, which brought an end to the British occupation. So on March 17th, 1776, the last British soldiers boarded ships and departed Boston. For many, many years, that was celebrated as Evacuation Day. And so it was not a long stretch for that to turn into St. Patrick's Day celebrations. The Continental Army entered the town. Residents began to return to a town destroyed. After a decade of protests, multiple occupations by the British Army, and plundering of the town's resources during the siege, there were wrecked buildings and depleted resources everywhere. It would take years to rebuild and recover, especially for ordinary men and women, even though most of the action of the Revolutionary War itself shifted away from Boston thereafter. For ordinary Bostonians, the road ahead was long and difficult. Thank you very much. I am happy to take questions from YouTube and possibly slowly sip on my seltzer for a moment while you ask the first one.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation, and we do have some questions coming in from our YouTube viewers. So one of them asks, I was under the impression that food was allowed to freely enter Boston after the port bill. Otherwise, there would be starvation and disease in Boston. Is this correct?
It was allowed to enter. That doesn't mean it was easy or flowing nearly as readily as it had been before June 1st of 1774. So I think yes, it was allowed. The Port Act specifically had carve-outs for food and fuel, for wood, right? As just that was an absolute necessity, for exactly the reasons that the person who asked the question pointed to. But they could not get the same supply of food across Boston Neck that they had been getting by ship. There was just simply no way to keep up as a practical matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And another question, in regards to the Quartering Act, were soldiers first intended to use and build barracks, or were they automatically living in people's homes?
They did a little bit of everything. When the Quartering Act gave the commanders at whatever level, right, the colonel of a regiment or the general, more power to force the issue when they needed to put people in homes. They did build barracks. They did board in people's homes. Some remained, for those who remember the story of the massacre or who live, if anyone's local to Boston, Castle Island, which is no longer an island, was a fort, right? There's remnants of a fort there now. And there were soldiers stationed there offshore throughout this period. So there's some there, there's some in barracks, there's some in housing. Some of the officers, certainly in the earlier occupation of the 1760s, some of the officers like make friends with a rich person and live in their den, or not their den, right, but in a spare bedroom, because wealth trumps political ideology. And so, right, we're both rich guys, so I can put you up. And that continues to be true, at least for the loyalists in 74 and 75. They sometimes will take over houses of people who've abandoned the town. So it's a little bit of everything is really what happens. There's not I don't think, and I'm not a military historian, but I don't think there's one dominant way that they go about it.
Okay. Well, I'll ask the next question. You mentioned the just dire drop off of sales of goods or advertisements of goods. Thinking about how the phrase supply chain became a household term in 2020.
Yep.
And can you speak to sort of the relationship between the stopping of imported goods and all of the other things that would have been affected in Boston, whether or not they were directly being imported. Like what happened to the supply chains essentially?
I mean, the short answer is it's actually quite a good way to put the phrase the Boston Port Act is that it is a supply chain disruption. Um, so it cuts off most trade goods. So,
Mhm.
right, to go back to the first question, food and fuel are allowed. You're allowed to bring in food. You're allowed to bring in fuel. It's not easy to do by ship because the British are checking every single ship. So that's even if they get it through by ship, it's expensive, it's slow. And Boston Neck is one street, and it's not
Mhm.
right. There's not a lot of different pathways to get into town. Um, and otherwise, right, you can put it on a ferry from Charlestown or from Cambridge, right? There are some other, but right, it's not going to be large scale. Um, so even the things that are easy to get in are difficult to get in. Can't find toilet paper anymore because the paper mills are all overrun. Not to give everyone horrible flashbacks while we're having this conversation. Um, and then, yeah, you're not allowed to bring in any fine goods. You're not allowed to bring in. So I should have read up more on my Paul Revere, but just thinking about somebody like Paul Revere
Mhm.
and his core business in silversmithing and metalsmithing to be able to get supplies of silver, no. The people he's working for on that silver are merchants and traders, and right, he's even though he's not in the elite of society, he needs the elite of society to have business,
Mhm.
and they're not making money anymore on the things that on selling flour and cloth and all the other kinds of goods that are coming, wine, all sorts of other things. So somebody like Paul Revere, even if he's directly impacted, he has trouble getting silver.
Mhm.
And then he's indirectly impacted in a whole bunch of ways because the people he does business with most of the time aren't buying silver, aren't buying
Right.
silver, crafted silver, right? They're not buying the finished product.
Right.
Um,
Right.
right. And the same thing for, I like to call them my printers because of how much time I've spent with the newspapers. But,
Mhm.
right, they're having trouble getting paper. They're having trouble getting ink. They're having trouble getting replacement type. The metal type isn't, none of it's made in America. It's all made in England.
Mm.
Um, and so if the type breaks, they can't get replacements.
Yeah.
Um, and then the advertising dries up and they need support. Now, some of the Patriot papers, what they're able to do is get support. Isaiah Thomas is one of the ones I mentioned. He's getting money from Hancock. The loyalist ones are getting government contracts. The governor is saying, here, print a bunch of stuff for me and I'll pay you. And the British Customs Office is saying, here, print our records and the things we need to have printed, right? So they have that contract, but they're not making any money that they were 3, 4 years earlier.
Mhm.
Uh, that all dries up, and so everybody's reliant on patronage of one sort or another much more extensively.
Yeah. And I'll pipe in about Paul Revere. So, in terms of getting silver, he was getting some of his silver from abroad, and some of it was what we would today call recycled, in that people would bring an old item of theirs as partial payment or to be melted down. So, he had access to probably some silver, but you're absolutely right that he doesn't have customers. So, it doesn't matter that those customers might have silver.
Yes.
And we know that he worked a lot of side jobs and he was very skilled at coming up with side businesses. But the Boston that you described, it sounds like everyone's trying for a third or fourth job, and so that market itself would be extremely tough.
Yeah.
We have another comment coming in. Um, this one, the viewer is surprised that smallpox is a problem in Boston because Boston was where inoculation had been established in the colonies in 1721 and had periodic smallpox outbreaks that were controlled. Can you tell us a bit about the context of how we went from good at inoculation to it's a problem?
So first, I'd recommend to the commenter that they read Andrew Wehrman's new book, whose title I'm forgetting, but it's a fantastic book on smallpox in New England in the 1770s. Um, wish I could remember the title off the top of my head, but I cannot. And I very carefully made sure my phone was far away for this talk. But he's going to be a great source. It's a really good question, because yes, there is smallpox inoculation is introduced in the 1720s epidemic in Boston. The flip side of that is it's not very popular. There are battles over inoculation and whether it should be practiced. It does involve actually infecting somebody with the smallpox virus. It is not right. Vaccines are a dead form of the virus. You don't get the illness. Smallpox inoculation, you get smallpox, a milder form, but you get smallpox and you can give it to other people. You're contagious. So there's a hot debate. So it is not practiced extensively, certainly not practiced extensively as a prophylactic measure. It's not something that most people do in the ordinary course of time, right? It's not the way we do childhood vaccinations now. You don't, when you get to 2, you go and get your vaccinations. So it's not something that's kept up with. And smallpox is intermittent enough in the colonies that there's always a lot of people who are susceptible. So they get there was an outbreak in 1764 in the Boston area that canceled Harvard commencement. But then not again for 11 years. And so there's a lot of people who are susceptible to it. Abigail Adams gets inoculated in the middle of this time frame. I forget exactly when. It might have been closer to into 1776 that she actually got inoculated. But she and her children, she has her children inoculated as well. But yeah, no, it is a serious issue, and there actually are a lot of people because it's not popular. It's not something you just do in the ordinary course. You sometimes do it when there's an epidemic. There's like this uptick of people getting inoculated to try to avoid getting really sick. And it's considered controversial. There are people who are anti-inoculation throughout this period arguing against it. So the British, by contrast, and it's not really even so much, it's a little bit that the army has gotten into inoculation, and it's a lot that smallpox was much more endemic. It was much more common in Britain. So there weren't these huge outbreaks, right? It was just sort of a long-term percolation. So, an 18-year-old British man signing up for the army had probably already been exposed. And once you're exposed, and you're good if you survive it.
Right.
So most of the British Army was not susceptible to it. Much of the American colonists and the Colonial Army, and especially the Continental Army, was New England militiamen. They were coming from all around these rural areas where smallpox didn't usually get very far. It's very much, right, it relies on concentrations of population, so it's not getting to Framingham very much in the 1760s. It's not getting to Worcester or backwoods New Hampshire, places like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate the question, because I'm glad to have the chance to expand on that and then go read Andrew Werman's book.
Yeah, absolutely. Looks like I've got another comment coming in that has not yet appeared on my end, so we'll hang tight a moment. Yeah. So Andrew Werman's new book is The Contagion of Liberty. Thanks, Emily.
There we go. Thank you.
Yes. So I will vamp for a moment in case there are audience members who are currently formulating questions they have not yet asked. But I do want to thank again both the GBH Forum Network and the Lowell Institute. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Adelman. This was a great presentation. And we do have another question. Which...
I will add at this point, people are welcome to reach out and email me. If you look me up on Google, you can find contact information pretty readily, and I'm happy to talk and answer questions about anything you'd like to discuss.
Excellent, thank you. So I think I'll make this one that's coming in right now our final question for this evening. Which prominent patriot leaders, if any, remained in Boston through the British evacuation?
Through the evacuation?
Yes.
I don't think anybody. Um,
There's none that I can think of.
yeah, after April 19th, they would have been arrested if they'd been in Boston. I mean,
Mhm.
the only name that comes to mind is Benjamin Church, but that's because he was a spy for the British and a traitor.
Right. He was on their side.
But
Yes.
Revere doesn't go back, Hancock doesn't go back, the Adamses don't go back.
Yeah.
The printers who are patriot printers go to Watertown and Worcester and various other places, and don't come back until the British leave. So yeah, I don't think anybody.
Yeah. Revere and his family spent that year in Watertown. We have some lovely correspondence between Revere and his wife as she was arranging for a pass to get the family out of town. So yeah, they were not in Boston. Mhm. All right. Well, thank you again so much for
Thank
your time
you.
and your expertise. And I hope that the rest of the audience enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you very much.
I believe we're still live.
So here we go. We are good now. I can stop the